Terrific. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this IPSO seminar. This is Bianca Stroman, who's Head of Complaints at IPSO, and this is Charlotte Irwin, who's Head of Standards at IPSO. They've kindly come in and given up their time to talk to us today about reporting of suicide, the pitfalls to avoid and how to do so sensitively in terms of the code of practice and generally. They'll be talking about inquests and also at the end of the session they've kindly agreed to talk to us about intrusion into grief generally. People have found this very helpful in the Q&A sessions to discuss matters that you encounter on a regular basis as far as sensitivity is concerned, how to approach somebody after a recent bereavement, when not to approach someone after a recent bereavement. So please do take advantage of their expertise and knowledge on this subject, because it has proved, and we've got lots of positive feedback, it has proved to be very interesting and useful. So without further ado, this is Bianca Stroman from IPSO.
Thanks, Paul. So thank you for coming and listening to us talk about the reporting of suicide. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction to the topic and sort of why the code says what it says effectively, and then I'll talk a bit about the code and some IPSO decisions that kind of show where the line is maybe on the reporting of suicide, and then Charlotte's going to talk a bit more generally about the topic sort of aside from code issues, and then obviously you'll be able to ask any questions at the end and talk about intrusion more generally, as Paul mentioned. So as I said, I thought it'd be useful to start by talking about some research that sort of explains a bit how the suicidal impulse works, because I think there's a perception, and it was certainly my perception before I started doing this job and learned a bit more about all of this, that if somebody is vulnerable and decides to take their own life, then they will be aware of a number of lethal methods, and they will simply choose one of those methods, and they will go ahead with taking their own life. And if one method isn't available, then maybe they'll just use another one. In fact, there's a lot of research, it's been research for the past few decades that shows that actually the availability and knowledge of particular methods can have an increase on suicide rates. And if a method is restricted, then actually maybe people don't go on to take their own lives. And there was some research from Taiwan in 2015 that I think shows this quite nicely, where the researchers wanted to look at charcoal burning suicides, which there have been sort of rising rates of. And so what they did was they restricted access to charcoal briquettes in New Taipei City. So before, you'd just been able to buy them from the shelves, sort of as you can here, and they put them behind locked cabinets, and people had to go and ask for the charcoal briquettes. And you can see from this chart the drop in the rates of suicides from charcoal burning after they introduced that measure. So the blue is pre-introduction of the restrictions and the orange is afterwards. So we see across most groups there was quite a dramatic fall. And what's interesting is that there wasn't a corresponding rise in suicides by other methods. So in restricting access to this particular lethal method, the researchers found that what they'd done was lowered the rate of suicides more generally in that city. So that's just a bit of introduction to how suicidal impulse and availability of methods kind of interact. Something that you might be more familiar with, and perhaps is a bit more pertinent to you as journalists, is some research that was published this year, so it's really recent, that looked into the impact of the death of Robin Williams and the reporting of that on rates of suicide in the US. So there's been a lot of research over the past few decades that suggests that when the media publish details of a method of suicide, then that can lead to an increase in suicides more generally, and particularly imitative acts, so people taking their own lives by the same method as the one they read about in the media. And this is sort of most recent research that supports this. Obviously, Robin Williams was a very prominent individual. He took his life in August 2014. His suicide was very widely reported, and as the researchers noted, a lot of the media in the US didn't follow World Health Organization guidelines on how to responsibly report suicide to stop simulative acts. There was a press conference that the police did where they talked about the belt that he used and talked about the position that his body was found in. So there was a lot of detail in the media about how Robin Williams killed himself. And you can see from the chart, it's a bit unclear, but sort of just to the left of the middle, you can see the predicted, sort of expected suicide rates are in the grey line, and the black line is the actual suicide rates. And you see there's a huge spike from August 2014 for the next few months. It sort of seems to coincide with detailed reporting of the way in which Robin Williams took his life. There's this big spike, and that spike is mostly, in fact, asphyxiation and suffocation deaths, so people using the same method that he used. So that's a bit of an introduction, and then we have the code. So this is clause 5 of the code, which is about reporting suicide. As I was saying, there's research that shows that when people read a lot of detail about a method of suicide in the press, that can lead them to imitative acts, simulative acts, and to take their own life by that same means. And that's not just people who otherwise would have used another lethal method. It's people who otherwise just might not have gone through with taking their own lives because something wasn't as readily available to them. So this clause of the code, I think, it's quite different from a lot of the rest of the code in that it's about protecting public health, and so it's quite distinct from everything else. It's got a clear public health purpose. It talks about excessive detail, but that's not excessive detail from a sort of taste or moral standpoint. It's excessive detail that could lead to simulative acts. So it's specifically there to try and prevent this phenomenon of people reading in detail about a method of suicide in the media and then going on to imitate that. So the question that a lot of people will ask is, what is excessive detail? Is there a line that we can draw where you say this definitely is and this definitely isn't? Unfortunately, the short answer is no, because it's not for IPSO to obviously tell any of you what you can and can't publish. We're not trying to stop people writing about suicide. We're not trying to say, never write this article, never include this detail. The point of the code is to, as I say, protect public health. So it's for you as journalists and as editors to think about whether something's excessive or not. And the question to ask is, are the details included in this article sort of sufficient? Is there enough detail that this could lead somebody to know how to, I don't want to use the word successfully, but I'm going to sort of effectively end their life? And that's the question that you're asking. And generally, standards of reporting are really, really good in this area. I think people are very aware of the importance of it and of the responsibility that the media has. So we don't see a lot of problematic reporting. We don't have a lot of upheld complaints about this. But we do have one, and that's up on the screen, which is Farrow versus Lancashire Evening Post. The part in italics at the bottom is the Complaints Committee explaining what the purpose of Clause 5 is. I mentioned that earlier. And this article was a report of a death by hanging. The article reported that the person who died was found suspended from a bunk bed, and the photo caption identified the ligature as a pair of leggings. Now that was excessive detail, telling people what ligature to use and what point of suspension to use was considered excessive detail by the Complaints Committee, and that complaint was upheld. And I think I said there wasn't a firm line, but there's a few rules of thumb, and this does illustrate one of them. I think when reporting hangings, including the ligature and the point of suspension is something that may well be excessive detail and could contribute to simulative acts. Equally, if you're reporting a hanging and there's a particularly unusual ligature that might be readily available to people, but they wouldn't necessarily think of it as something that they could use in a hanging suicide, or something else that might be problematic for excessive detail. A few other kind of rules of thumb are deaths by overdose, reporting the drug and the exact number of pills, something that could cause simulative acts, and in chemical suicides, giving details of the chemical and the way in which it was administered. So, those are some, as I say, not black lines, but good rules of thumb to bear in mind of things that might be excessive and lead to simulative acts. There are and another key point actually on that is novel methods. Again, it's not something we've got any decisions on because we don't see problematic reporting about it particularly often. But there's a lot of evidence suggesting that if you report a lot of detail of novel or generally unknown methods of suicide, that can lead to a huge spike in people using that method and in suicides more generally. Other methods are slightly less clear-cut. Train suicides, for example. It's sort of generally accepted that giving the exact location at which someone took their life by a train could well lead to simulative acts, because you're giving people, you're telling people that, you know, this is a place you can get access to a train track and trains will be going fast enough to kill you. But beyond that, there's sort of debate about, you know, certain public health officials think that giving the time of the train is excessive detail. You know, we don't have a firm rule on that. We've not ruled on it, but it's something worth bearing in mind. And the flip side of that question is, you know, you're thinking, is this information that is sufficient to enable somebody to take their own life? But the other question, of course, you're asking yourself is the inclusion of this information justified? Because, as I say, we're not trying to tell you what to write, and we definitely don't want to prevent the media from reporting on deaths and inquests and suicides, because it's a really important thing that the press does, and the purpose of the code and the purpose of IPSO is not to stop that happening. So if you're writing a story and there's a detail and you're unsure about it, just ask yourself the question of, why is this in here? Can I not tell the story without this detail? Is this detail really important to the story that we're trying to tell here? And in which case, it may well not be considered excessive detail. So we have an example here, a complaint which was Hartley versus the Lancaster Guardian, which was a report of an inquest where somebody had shot themselves in the mouth. There was evidence from the family heard at the inquest, which was included in the article. And they talked a lot about how happy he'd been, and he was in a pretty positive state of mental health in the run-up to his death. So they didn't believe that he would have taken his own life. The gun that he used, they said, was a very old gun and had discharged by accident in the past. And so, you know, they believed it wasn't suicide, it couldn't be suicide, it was accidental death. And this piece of information that I've got there, the quote about putting the shotgun in his mouth and discharging it, was evidence given by the police at the inquest. And that was included in the article to explain why the coroner returned a verdict of suicide despite the family's evidence to the contrary. So, you know, it was really important to, where you've got a dispute between the family and the police and the coroner, for a report of the inquest to explain why the coroner reached the verdict, and this evidence was really crucial to explaining that verdict, so it wasn't considered excessive detail. So that's sort of my quick rush through the code and some decisions, and I'll hand over to Charlotte to talk a bit more generally.
Great. Thank you, Bianca. So I'm going to speak about issues that are sort of outside the code, really, but things to bear in mind when you're reporting on suicide. I suppose before I get started, I just want to very much echo what Bianca said. None of what I'm about to say is here to kind of prevent you from reporting on suicide, but it is really to give you some things to think about when you're writing these sorts of stories. I think the first thing, we've already talked a little bit about kind of the research into the suicide of Robin Williams. Obviously, the research shows it seems likely that there was a significant increase in the number of suicides following his death, partially as a result of the way in which that story was reported. I think there is certainly good research out there which shows that when there is a celebrity suicide in particular, because it is a celebrity, you do see a greater number of people vulnerable people who might decide to end their lives following that kind of very newsworthy event, because of kind of idealization of the celebrity, a desire to emulate and all of that. So if you're thinking about writing a story on a celebrity suicide, it's helpful just to think about the impact of what you're writing, and as I say, that can be heightened because it's a story of a suicide of a celebrity. Another thing to think about is kind of the challenges around reporting clusters of suicides, what some people might call hotspots of suicides, things like that. And here, obviously, there's a very difficult balance to be struck, because rightly, you want to kind of talk about why there might be a cluster, why there might be a higher than expected number of suicides in a particular area, kind of what are the underlying issues, are there concerns there that, as we should be addressing as a society. But I think there's also there's a balance to be struck between, that kind of public interest journalism, with also, again, not wanting to over-dramatise that cluster, draw attention to it so that, again, vulnerable people in the area or indeed kind of elsewhere who might be reading that research, might be reading that report, might be influenced by that particular report. And I think, we saw this years ago with the reporting of the cluster of suicides in and around Bridgend, for example. At the time, there was a lot of conversation about kind of the balance to be struck in media reporting in these sorts of issues. And I think it's just something to bear in mind where you've got those clusters, thinking carefully about kind of the language that you might use and the positioning. Which I think leads me on also to talk about kind of prominence and justification. Some suicides, again, thinking about celebrity suicides in particular, will naturally be quite high-profile events because of who it is who has decided to take their own life. But again, just thinking about kind of the way in which the article appears in print or online, the headline, kind of how much emphasis you put on it, is all helpful just in terms of thinking about that vulnerable person who might be reading that report and, reducing the potential for that report then to influence them in order to decide to take their own lives. But I think the other thing that it's important to bear in mind is that there's something called the Papageno effect. For those of you who don't know, and I include myself in this, Papageno is a character from The Magic Flute who is dissuaded from taking his own life because of kind of other characters persuade him not to. And again, just that there is really good research around kind of the impact of excessive or irresponsible reporting on suicide rates. So there is also research which shows that, reports around kind of perhaps interviews with individuals who've survived a suicide attempt, or interviews with families who have been bereaved of the impact of the loss of a loved one, kind of thinking about those sorts of stories can actually have a very positive impact on vulnerable people who might be at that point of crisis and actually dissuade them from taking steps to take their own life. And I think this is where I think there is a really powerful role for the media in how we talk about suicide. I think thinking about this for me personally, I think the way as a society we talk about suicide has changed dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. You see campaigns now around why suicide is the leading cause of death in men under, I think it's under 40 and things like that. There's much more awareness of the impact of this issue as a kind of public health matter, as Bianca was talking about. And I think that's very much because of the way in which these stories are framed, kind of the conversations that we're having now as a society, and the kinds of stories that I'm seeing in kind of newspapers and magazines and online as well. And I think it's very positive that there is that role for the media in terms of dissuading people at that point of crisis as well, and the very powerful effect that those kind of stories can have. And I suppose, having thought about that, I suppose the other reason why we're really here today is to talk to you a bit about how we can all help, how we at IPSO can help you. Obviously, I know you've got Paul here as a source of advice and your legal team as well. But we also offer advice for editors and journalists who are writing a story and want a bit of advice on how to make sure that they comply with the code. So, for example, we are sometimes contacted by journalists who want to know whether a particular detail of an inquest report might be considered excessive detail, as Bianca was talking about. The guidance is the advice is offered by my colleagues in the complaints team, informed by the huge number of complaints that we receive, but also informed by conversations like the ones that we had with your colleagues yesterday, conversations and meetings that we have with editors and journalists to kind of hear what the issues are that you're seeing and kind of to feed that back to you. In addition to kind of that sort of bespoke one-to-one advice, which is done over the phone and is confidential and non-binding as well, it's just really to help to equip journalists and editors with kind of the things that they need to think about, the questions that Bianca was posing earlier. We also have online guidance, which is available on our website, talking about kind of how to go about reporting deaths and inquests in particular with sensitivity and sympathy as required under the code. And we're also going to be producing some guidance soon on our website on the reporting of suicides as well. So that's why, again, from our perspective, it's really valuable to come along and talk to all of you about kind of the questions that you might have, because we want to be addressing those questions in the guidance that we produce as well. And that's available on our website. The other thing I would say is, if you are ever speaking to a family member or a friend of somebody who's died and they've got some questions about why a journalist might be reporting on an inquest, we've actually produced some information for the public as well, which you can direct people to, which explains why journalists might be there reporting at an inquest and kind of explains a bit of the code as well. And I'd encourage you to use that if you see fit. So I suppose I'm going to close on a positive note, which is, as Bianca says, we do think that there has been a change in kind of reporting of suicide in the last 10 years. Bianca and I were in a meeting with the Samaritans last week, and that's very much what the Samaritans see as well. There has been a real change. Journalists are thinking much more about these sorts of issues, and I think this is where coming along and talking to you today is really valuable. You'll see behind me there's a quote from for Richard Best, who's a former editor who sits on our complaints committee, about how standards of reporting has changed, and I would agree with him. And I think this is a very positive thing. As I say, I think that in terms of the conversations that we are having as a society on these issues, they have moved significantly, and I think that's a very positive situation. We're going to stop talking at you now, and now it's really over to you on the floor for any questions that you might have about suicide or kind of inquests or kind of reporting deaths more generally, or indeed about IPSO matters more broadly, if you'd like to raise those as well. Very happy to answer any questions that you might have. I've got a willing volunteer to go first.
Something that was triggered, the complaints that you were raising, it's not exactly press, but the campaign that This Morning did on South Bank with all the models on top of the roof, would that generate complaints? Because I know that we did a sort of celeb story about how it was discussed on This Morning. I just I wonder, because that's got people on the edge of buildings and
Yeah,
stuff.
no. I know the campaign that you're referring to. I don't think we got any complaints about newspaper coverage of that.
No, I'm not even familiar with the campaign, which I think suggests that we didn't get any complaints, so I would have seen them.
I mean, I think more generally there was quite a lot of debate from other suicide. It was quite interesting because there was some debate from other suicide charities as to whether that campaign with the statues on the one with the statues on top of the building was actually helpful or not. I think it was very eye-catching, but as I say, I know that for some charities kind of came out and said, this is an interesting campaign, but we're not quite sure, kind of where it's going or kind of what its purpose is. Certainly, as Bianca said, we didn't get any complaints about it, and I think, again, it would very much depend on the nature of the report. I think the issue would be, how are you reporting it? If you're reporting it as a campaign to raise awareness of the high rates of male suicide, for example, in a particular age group, I can't see that in itself would lead to kind of any kind of code concerns. Obviously, if you were then saying details of where you could go to take your life by jumping off a building, then obviously that would raise, that would obviously be kind of a code issue. But I think in the way that kind of you're talking about that sort of reporting, I can't see that it would raise concerns there in that way. Any further questions? No?
Is there anything that have you dealt with general intrusion into grief?
No,
No.
we're happy to answer any
If
questions.
anyone's
that
got any
anyone-
questions about intrusion into grief, generally about approaching people when you should, please feel free. That's fine.
So one of the things that came up yesterday, which we had quite a good conversation about, was around the language of suicide, and I'd just be interested to kind of get some thoughts from you, because something that we do get contacted about by a reasonable number of suicide charities is about the phrase commit suicide, and whether or not we should still be using that language. So I'm going to open it out to the floor, so over to you. I'm just wondering whether anybody has ever come to you, if you've reported on a suicide, and said, oh, I really don't like the language that you've used, I don't want you to use the phrase at all, or if that's not something that you've really come across.
We do have complaints about it. And I mean, I have to say that I wouldn't actively choose to put that in a headline, but because it is such common phraseology that's always been used, it's actually instinctively you sometimes do it.
Yeah.
I've got to get myself out of the habit of doing it really, but I think I see where they're coming from. I mean, suicide isn't a crime, but obviously committed is the word that's used in conjunction with crime. So we had a complaint over the weekend about it. Actually.
Interesting. Okay. Anybody else got any experience with that at all?
I think we've probably had 3 complaints about that in the last couple of months, which they've been resolved quite easily, and there are obviously pressure groups who are looking out for it and contacting the professionals as soon as they do it.
Yeah.
I think they probably want to raise awareness, because I think even among sort of ordinary people, it's not, people don't think about that language, and they don't think about why we use the word commit, and when it's explained to them, people think, oh, actually, I do see there's a stigmatising problem, but it's something that's used without.
Just say it,
common
don't,
parlance,
don't,
yeah.
don't think about saying it. It's not
Yeah.
sort of taboo phrase.
Mhm.
No.
But
Yeah.
I think we probably will stop using it eventually.
Interesting.
Sorry.
I've now got two.
Do you have any figures in terms of how many complaints on average you get about suicide reporting and how many of those are upheld in proportion to how they got?
I don't have the figures of how many complaints we get about suicide reporting more generally. We've upheld one complaint. We don't get a lot of complaints that are about use of excessive detail, because I think you don't see it that much. So generally the complaints we get about suicide reporting are the same sorts of complaints that you get reporting any other inquest, which is they misreported the inquest, or I didn't realise that anybody was going to report the inquest and I'm really upset by this, or very distressing things were heard at the inquest and this member of the family didn't know and then they read about it in the paper. So that there aren't a lot, we don't have a lot of Clause 5 complaints, as I said, which is why we don't have a whole body of decisions to tell you what's definitely a breach of the code. I think we've upheld one. But obviously, a lot of our complainants are people who are bereaved, and so, a lot of them may have somebody who they love who has taken their own life, because it's a sort of people who tend to be upset by press coverage and want to come to us.
In terms of intrusion into grief, do you get many complaints from people who've been contacted on Facebook or other social media by reporters who might have lost a loved one like a couple of days earlier?
It's something that doesn't actually come up as much as you would expect, I think, and we don't really have any decisions on it again. So it is something that people raise when they come to IPSO, because I think for some people there's a sort of feeling that journalists should never contact you if you're bereaved, and by contacting a bereaved person then they've done something wrong. But obviously that's not the way the code works, and that's not what IPSO says, because of course journalists should be able to contact people as long as they do it sensitively and don't continue doing it when they're told not to, because lots of people might want to talk to you. And social media is, I suppose, a common way of getting in touch with people, and possibly feels less intrusive than somebody knocking on your door, because you can ignore it so much more easily. But no, we don't have sort of lots of complaints about that, or upheld complaints.
Is excessive detail usually just about the method, or can it be about the reason that they took their own life? So if it's like he took his own life shortly after losing his job, would that potentially be?
So excessive detail from a code point of view is about the method, and the code's quite explicit on that. But I know that various suicide charities have separate concerns about sort of simplification of reasons, because it's not the case that usually the one thing happens and then somebody just takes their own life. Suicide is a lot more complex than that. We get sort of accuracy complaints about that sometimes with a report of an inquest where, particularly in a headline or in an article, the journalist has sort of picked up on what seems to be the most interesting thing that was said at the inquest, and suggested that that's the reason that the coroner gave for the person taking their own life, but in fact the inquest went into a lot more detail and talked about a lot of different issues.
Anybody else? Anything else?
Do you have most complaints about, which area do you have most complaints about?
Accuracy. Yeah, we get loads and loads of complaints about accuracy. Also, the sorts of things that we can't necessarily deal with. You get a lot of complaints about taste, or kind of broadly things that people think are offensive, or discrimination against an entire group, which obviously isn't prohibited in the code. So those are the things we get the biggest volume on, I think.
And is it mainly people who directly link to the story, or is it no? Because it all used to be, didn't it? Sort of.
Yeah, so you get, accuracy complaints, obviously they could be from absolutely anybody, and anyone can complain about a general point of fact. With complaints about other things, you will quite often get people who have seen an article in the paper and they think this is really intrusive into X's life, but they don't know X, and they will complain and say, well, the press shouldn't do this kind of thing. But we can't take those complaints forward because obviously we don't know how upset the subject of the story was about that, or whether they were involved or consented to it being published.
Great. Right. Anything further? Well, then I shall. Am I allowed? I think we are. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming along. It's really lovely to meet you.
Thank you.